HBO's Chernobyl is a dark, gloomy, frightful, and methodical retelling of the 1986 catastrophe in the Chernobyl region of the modern-day Ukraine and then Soviet Socialist Republic of the Ukraine, part of the larger Soviet Union. And of course, as everybody probably already knows, the story revolves around the core explosion and meltdown that occurred during operation and the subsequent emergency efforts undertaken to clean up the toxic radiation fallout. While you could break down the miniseries into a host of topics, themes, and modern day analogies, I'd say the two most salient would be the Saturnine mood and overall motif around syncretism or monotheism of Yahweh and the power of unity, along with the overarching idea of the emerging Apollonian transmission, achieving critical mass, nuclear reactions, and the surprise of bursting through the core reactor. So you don't even need to watch the whole miniseries to get the main gist of the story. And I probably wouldn't recommend going through hours of the show, but overall it's a pretty good put together film or series. So before starting the analysis, you have to think about what the artist is trying to tell us, the writer and the director, but also what does he want the audience to think of? Who is the audience? So the casting is all European characters, which makes sense. It's supposed to be this serious look into what went wrong during this historical event and how government bureaucracy, lying, and just power dynamics work in modern political systems, which becomes clearer in a disaster, right? The people from behind the shadows become more visible and mortal-like as the head of the state suddenly shirks back, afraid that their power is not so absolute, and others might find out. And it's intentional that the characters are portrayed as white, so serious people will watch, or at least midwit people will watch and get their cues for the modern dialectic of democratic politics. Also, we have to realize it's intentional casting, the creation of this fake female scientist character, all white cast. It's interesting because there was no controversy about the diversity of the cast in this series that I know of, which makes me believe the producer or whoever okayed the film knew the audience they wanted, right? In European people, once again, there was no discussion like they intentionally do with other films. And that's done to politicize films and get people to vote eventually. This leads on to one of the most prominent moods or feelings of the film, and that is fear. Fear of political retribution, where the lead character, nuclear scientist Valery Legasov, doggedly and cautiously unravels the whole story of incompetence, cowardice, and deceit that brought down the Soviet Union ultimately and left them at the moment with a black eye for the whole West to see. And Valery Legasov ends up killing himself. And in the first episode, we see him recording this anonymous podcast, right, where he's naming them. And he smokes his last cigarette and he feeds his cat and then he kills himself in solitude. He leaves behind all the evidence in recorded cassette form to unravel the Soviet governing malpractice during the meltdown. And he delivers the evidence in a super spooky way because every turn is going to be the moment he's whisked away by undercover partisan agents. And once again, fear of this ominous all-seeing power, this Saturnine monopole where you have to live alone and be afraid of every move being watched by one power that's disconnected, invisible, but also at the same time this unified authority that could be on every block corner, extremely visible. Everyone gets this feel from Soviet movies, and I would interpret Soviet themes or authoritarian communist motifs as like a metaphor for Saturn, and more specifically the idea of monotheism and syncretism into a supreme composite god, where all the departments or arms of the government are working for the same superior structure of the Soviet Union, where Saturn is the father of the Olympians, like Jupiter, Hades, and Neptune, Juno, and he incorporates all their qualities, powers, and crafts. They are the seed of him, right? The product of him. And it's interesting that the communists have adapted the sickle of Saturn and the hammer of Hephaestus, or in the Sumerian mythos, Enlil, the winter god, who's like Saturn, old man, father time, and his pickaxe, along with his deputy, Anki, the god who fulfills the decrees of the chief god Enlil and brings order to the mortal world through the power of his gold scepter. Moreover, the brutalist architecture that we associate with Soviet Russia and Eastern Europe is this facade that's cold, lifeless, dark, but it's also constructed in this conscientious way to achieve maximum utility with the least investment into aesthetical beauty, right? It's literally oppressing you by just looking at it. While you can argue the same gods are worshipped in the West too, and I would agree, but it's represented in a more discernible way along this discontinuous spectrum of political agencies and departments, and it's broken up into local and state officials, which does still, even today, like weaken the power of the federal government. And you could probably say the U.S. is just as bureaucratic and as much of a behemoth as the Soviet Union was, where like the DMV and all these government administrative and clerical agencies have been turned into like an affirmative action workers program effectively. In addition, the series flows with this meticulous and prodding way of dancing around the main issue, which is kind of the whole crux of Chernobyl, much like our society, right where you can't say with confidence in public what the real problem is. Where in the show it's because of the inefficiency of this massive government and the strings that hold it together, and then it's built off deception. Our rivals know that their situation is kind of like a sandcastle of lies that can unravel faster than it takes to build up. So they want the audience, the white people, to be afraid of speaking the truth. But there's also the stupid, divisive plot things that are meant to drive political debate and intrigue further, along the calendar of the 4-year democratic cycle. Like this, the woman. It's like, oh my God, a woman is in a fictitious depiction of like a dramatization of a historical event. Oh my God. Furthermore, there's a sense that you should mistrust these white autocrats and authoritarianism. They project the collapse of the Saturnine-Soviet Union onto any type of foreseeable white group that will coalesce into this autocratic society. So they plant the seed of doubt into midwits that the West and liberalism is better and to not trust autocratic older white males. And in the first and second episodes, we get to see what happened at Ground Zero during the nuclear meltdown, with shots in the control room and eventually outside when the firefighters show up, and we eventually learn the core exploded, which is a huge surprise that this certain model of nuclear reactor could have such a catastrophic emergency that the core itself would be exposed to the outside world and atmosphere. And after the explosion breaks its containment wall, right? And it's here in the show where we see these black stones, or black rocks they call it. And the rocks are made of graphite, and the black graphite rocks are what allows them to realize the core was exposed and the radiation leak was much worse than first reported. And we link the symbolism of Saturn to the graphite black stones. And here we have this explosion of the black rock all over the ground into many pieces. And it reminds me of the story of Saturn devouring his kids from Hesiod's theogony. And we know that Jupiter wasn't swallowed by his father and got a potion that caused his father Saturn to throw up his younger siblings, which allowed Jupiter to defeat his father Saturn in the forthcoming Titan War, and resulting in the hierarchy of the Olympian mythos and pantheon. The storm god is number 1, and the Apollonian 2, and a host of other major and minor deities in this close competition for lower ranks of worship. So Saturn is also the one who seeded, or the one who sows the plants and crops. Once again, he's known as Father Time in the winter, as well as the patron god of farmers with his symbol of a sickle, like the Soviet flag. And it's from all these other Olympian gods that we get, these minor gods. Even Apollo to a certain extent, although he's kind of a separate god being generated out of the coupling of Jupiter and Leto, and distinct from his other siblings and relatives born from Saturn, like Juno, Hades, and Neptune. And Apollo we can associate with truth, light, the sun, oracles, and averting danger. I think we can interpret the arrival of Legasov at the scene, where the residual graphite of the black rock is what allows him to figure it all out in the end. The triumph of the Apollonian transmission, or the Apollonian character in the series, where the etymology of Valery comes from the Latin clan's name Valerius, which denotes strength, health, or boldness. These are Apollonian qualities. And the nuclear reactions are kind of interesting in that they're somewhat of an exception to Newton's law of conservation of energy, and that matter or mass can be equated to energy through Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc squared, where for most physical interaction in our world, yes, regular Newtonian physics is fine, but nuclear physics, the reaction that takes place with the neutrons that lie at the heart of the atom and the nucleus, thus the Newtonian physics can't be used. And from basic chemistry, we know most chemical reactions take place through the sharing or transferring of electrons in the outer clouds and result in these hybridizations of electronic and physical states of quantifiable energy that we know from the periodic table, and oxidation states, as well as like graphically as these spatial geometries of electron probability clouds. For nuclear reactors, it relies on a critical mass of nuclear fissile material that allows the reaction to take place. So if you have a bundle of uranium or other atoms of high atomic weights and are radioactive, you can get the neutrons to smash into each other or split or fissure into smaller atoms and release energy as a result. And the reaction is a runaway one in that it will release almost infinite amount of energy per ounce or gram of fissile material. It's this reaction. It's the runaway effect that causes the meltdown of the core, causing it to explode in the show Chernobyl, releasing enormous amounts of radiation that pulse out and it illuminates the sky with this white ionized light. And it's this light of Apollo, right? This sun. And this gets to the heart of monotheism versus polytheism, or this composite, syncretized God versus a more nuanced polytheism of an Olympian mythos. And that's how these are like reflections of historical political systems. Like Saturn or Saturnine means dark, gloomy, methodical, which is the vibe and flow of Chernobyl. You almost want to take a shower after watching to wash off the radioactive fallout and just shut all your blinds in a fit of paranoia. It gives off this contagious fear of being exposed, turned into the higher-ups, and eventually having Saturn come down on you. And we can interpret nuclear fallout and its spread unknowingly in the air as a metaphor for political ideas transferred through the ether. Like today, most communication isn't physical transfer of sound waves through like direct interaction with others, but digital transmissions where you can hear a podcast anytime and think about it whenever, and then send out your own signal from your core or your house, the center of your atomic state, right, the nucleus. And all these bits of information that are sent out in pulses are jumbled together and bounce off each other in this ethereal digital reactor vessel, right, that both are from our virtual online world but also our real world too. And eventually these bits of paragraphs, words, podcasts, memes react with one another, and they can be synthesized or fused into an effective narrative and an ideology. These little seemingly insignificant particles from the nucleus, like Valery seem small, like it's just him and his cat, but it can cause a runaway nuclear reaction if enough material is present in proximity to each other, like a stack of fissile nuclear material, like a pile of uranium. And the uranium rods in a reactor are controlled through graphite rods that slow the reaction. And again, graphite is this black stone or Saturn, and our energy can be so great that if they make a mistake, boom, the whole thing busts open. Even the graphite rods can't slow the reaction. Conversely, a sun acts kind of the opposite way, in that it takes these small atomic weight atoms like hydrogen or helium and fuses them into heavier elements. Eventually, some stars can get to iron where they're fusing iron, but all stars will collapse under their own weights eventually. And the supernova explosion of the great stars, like the big giant ones, allows for these heavier elements like gold and silver and platinum to be formed. And similarly, it's a nuclear reaction, the sun, right? It involves the atoms from the nucleus to be involved in this release of energy. So Legasov ends up meeting with Boris, who perhaps we can think of as this marshal-like figure, and that he can boss around the military, which in the Soviet Union was the most powerful organ of their whole body. This ability to mobilize infinite amount of manpower through the vessel of the Red Army and all its function is what allowed them really to win the Second World War. And the etymology of Boris is to fight. So again, he's the marshal. And he's a figure who maybe is too hot-headed at first at times, but it's because he's well guarded and he's misunderstood. And it's also interesting, right, that the Soviet military was called the Red Army, which is this martial symbol, and it resembles kind of the Roman way of tackling problems by just opening the gates of Janus and unleashing the war machine, the marshal. Anyways, at first, Boris is hostile to the seemingly nerdy Legasov, even threatening to kill him. But it's Valery Legasov who in the helicopter proves his worth by explaining that they can't go near the core and the exposed black rock of graphite. And it's there the understanding of the Marshal and the Apollonian working together ends up bringing down this Hulk of the Soviet Union and the monotheist worship of Saturn or Yahweh and whatever religion that you choose. Like the fear and panic we see today every day put forth in the media is to induce this psychological terror and plant ideas that certain people are in control, right? Chernobyl does this too, but it's obvious projection that the government, is working like in this incompetent, nefarious, and negligent way. But it's a way to like cover their own self through this projection onto the Soviet collapse, right? Where today it's kind of a different type of truth, but the same methodical prodding and ultimately depressing rule by Saturn. And the writer wants you to feel like you can't say anything, or else you'll have to kill yourself and record a secret tape to finally solve the mystery. And every block there's an agent ready to take you in. It's stupid, but it's effective because we have to understand the writer's expressing their worries that there's this type of person who will be logical and understand that through this agreement and partnership with the Marshall type, you can override subordinates of this dominant structure, this monolith of the Hebrew worship of Yahweh. Moreover, the theme of radiation is the spread of this Apollonian transmission, unfeathered. And it's funny, the Soviet government are worried in the series, Chernobyl, that Germany and the rest of the West will find out. Resembling today, where nobody in Europe or USA can get this pure Apollonian transmission undistorted. Everything is censored in some way or another because Saturn is terrified of this. The writer is terrified. The Soviets, in a similar fashion, with all these panicky things they do in an emergency, like move all kinds of earth, rock, and capital to cover their lies up, because it's the Apollonian that causes the meltdown panic, making them show the ugly face of this oppressive regime of Saturn, and the ultimate triumph of the truth in the end to figure it out. Contrasted it to, if you're a liberal, you're lulled to sleep, right? You think that, big science guys out there to prove big bad old government guys wrong with the help of woman science lady, and he'll do it in this Christ-like fashion to sacrifice his life, and then he'll feed his cat in his last supper and trust the court system that the truth will rule out, and liberal democracy is how you do science, So it's like, it's eternal big normie, eternal big midwit is the audience of this series. And there's some pretentious status-seeking, intelligentsia people, but it's the Apollonian the writer is afraid of, or signaling to those who might pick it up that of Legasov and Boris coming together, this figure who's both Marshall and Apollonian, that unknowing to the writer, these people are everywhere, talking in secret. They can't figure it out. What are they saying? That's why it's stupid to be afraid of speaking the truth. I don't have anxieties. My people aren't outnumbered by the millions. We're the stars, the generators of the energy of the system. We have a gravity of our own that is much more powerful than of the chthonic earth. Understand, we just have to work on these higher levels and see through the fog and gloom of the everyday morass of democratic politics. Whatever. Yeah, sure, everything is political now, even children's stuff. It's this burn of the graphite from the black rock of the exposed core. And the core is this chthonic symbol, akin to Moses and his wicker basket, or in Greek mythos, Tartarus, a protective lair for the Saturnine chief god. And it's the runaway momentum and energy of the Apollonian solar figure, Valery Legasov, a nuclear physicist. And it's the nuclear reactions that make it possible to break out of this world of gloominess and dark black clouds. We are the light in the sky, a beacon for all others to see, from Europe all the way to Australia, the Marshall and Apollonian united.